When did you catch the school principal laughing at something he shouldn't have? I'm sitting in the principal's office, ready to discuss the workplace harassment claim against me. It was from my teacher, Mrs. Callahan, who claimed my shoe squeaking was intrusive. She called it, and I quote, deliberate torture designed to undermine her authority. This all started 3 weeks ago, when I finally saved enough from my part-time job to buy these limited edition $180 Nikes. When I walked into school, I felt like I was him. Sure, they squeaked a little on the hallway floors, but so what? Half the basketball team sounds like a squeaky toy convention when they walk to practice. But as soon as I walked into class, the vein on Mrs. Callahan's forehead looked like it was about to pop. The more I walked, the more it would swell up. I tried tiptoeing, but that only made the squeaking worse. By day 3, she was clutching her coffee mug so hard her knuckles went white. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on Valentine's Day. My crush, the hottest girl in school, handed me a bag of candy hearts. Before I could even say thanks, Mrs. Callahan stormed over and snatched them out of my hands. First the squeaking, now this! Crinkling wrappers! Absolutely not. After that, my crush never spoke to me again. That hurt more than any detention. By the end of the week, she'd sent emails to the counselor and the vice principal about my disruptive footwear. That's when she crossed a line nobody saw coming. She got the school therapy dog banned, sweet, gentle Bailey, who helped kids with anxiety, all because his collar jingled at the same frequency pattern as my shoes. For the entire week, you could feel the depression in the air. Even teachers were asking where their favorite golden Labrador was. The whole time, I kept it a secret from my mom because I knew she would freak out. But when she insisted on going to the parent-teacher conference, fear filled my body. On the day, Mrs. Callahan's face was covered in angry red acne that I'd never seen before. Sigh. Here we go. As soon as we sat down to talk to her, she went off. Your son has been threatening me in front of other students. My mom's eyes widened. Threatening you? What did he say? Mrs. Callahan leaned in dramatically. He pointed finger guns at me and said, catch you later, with 3 aggressive shoe squeaks. My mom walked out without another word, and within 24 hours, things went completely nuclear. Mrs. Callahan had scheduled a literal hearing for Friday morning, and she showed up with a rolling suitcase full of evidence. As for me, I just had myself and my angry Latina mom who took time off work to be there. Mrs. Callahan presented her case with a PowerPoint about sonic weapons in educational environments, but I had an ace up my sleeve. You see, I'd spent the previous night with my phone's decibel meter app documenting every sound in her classroom. So when it was my turn to present, I pulled out my phone and played the recordings. The pencil sharpener, 72 decibels. The ancient heating system, 68 decibels. Someone eating chips, 65 decibels. But the best part was the compilation video I'd made. 47 different classroom sounds, all louder than my squeaky shoes, including Mrs. Callahan's own heels click-clacking at 71 decibels and her aggressive stapler at 74 decibels. The principal leaned forward, watching her slam that stapler over and over in the video while my squeaks were barely audible in the background. The room went completely silent. Then the principal made the sound, somewhere between a snort and a laugh, and coffee came out his nose. He grabbed tissues while trying to compose himself, but his shoulders were shaking. My mom was biting her lip to keep from laughing. Even the union representative was covering her mouth. The principal finally cleared his throat, looked at Mrs. Callahan and said, I'm concerned that we're using district resources to prosecute. Squeaky shoes. He turned to me and added, though perhaps you could try walking heel to toe to minimize the sound. Then he looked back at Mrs. Callahan, who was turning purple, and said, I'll be reviewing the workplace harassment policy with all staff. Specifically, the part about what constitutes actual harassment versus minor annoyances we all deal with in a building full of teenagers. Case dismissed, or so I thought. Over the next month, I received rejection letters from all 5 colleges I'd applied to. Each one mentioned concerns raised about behavioral issues. My transcript was clean. I immediately knew Mrs. Callahan was behind it. And that's when my mom said 2 words that changed everything. Si acabó. It's over. My mom's phone was already in her hand before I could even process what she meant, her fingers flying across the screen as she scrolled through her contacts. She started talking rapid-fire Spanish to her cousin, who worked at some law firm downtown, pacing back and forth in our kitchen while gesturing with her free hand, like she always did when she was really mad. I caught words like discriminación and venganza between all the legal terms I didn't understand. Her face had that look I'd only seen twice before, once when my older brother got suspended for something he didn't do, and once when our landlord tried to illegally raise our rent. Within an hour, she'd set up an appointment with someone named Veronica Vargas, who specialized in education law, and we were driving downtown in Mom's beat-up Honda with all 5 rejection letters in a folder on my lap. The next morning, we sat in Veronica's office, while she spread out all 5 letters on her desk, her eyebrows raising higher with each one she read. She grabbed a yellow highlighter and started marking the same phrase on each letter about behavioral concerns, and showed us how they all used identical wording, which wasn't normal for college rejections. She explained that this suggested someone from my school had contacted all 5 colleges after I'd already applied, which violated something called FERPA laws about student privacy. She had us sign a bunch of forms to request information from both the school district and all 5 colleges, typing up formal letters on her computer while we waited. Monday morning, I walked into school wearing my squeaky Nikes and making sure every step was extra loud on purpose. Mrs. Callahan's face went from normal to purple in about 2 seconds when she saw me in the hallway, and she immediately started writing on her pink slip pad. She marched over to the vice principal's office with me following behind, but when she handed him the write-up for intentional disruption, he just looked at it, looked at her, then looked at me, and handed it back, unsigned. Other teachers were watching from their doorways, and I could see them whispering to each other as Mrs. Callahan stormed back to her classroom. 3 days later, the guidance counselor called me out of study hall and pulled me into her office, closing the door behind us and speaking in this weird whisper voice. She told me she'd been getting calls from colleges asking about my disciplinary record, which didn't make sense because I'd never been in serious trouble before. She looked really uncomfortable and kept fidgeting with her pen while explaining that Mrs. Callahan had filed some kind of official complaint that was now in my permanent file, and she had to send it when colleges called. I pulled out my phone and hit record without her noticing, asking her to repeat what she just said about Mrs. Callahan filing complaints after my applications were already submitted. Veronica filed the formal complaint with the district the next day, citing retaliation, defamation, and violation of my educational rights in this thick packet of legal documents. The district assigned someone named Alan Hopkins as an investigator, and his assistant started calling everyone involved to schedule interviews. Mrs. Callahan suddenly got sick and took 3 days days off in a row, leaving us with substitutes who had no idea what we were supposed to be learning. My mom went on our local community Facebook group that night and posted this vague question about whether other parents had experienced teacher retaliation without mentioning any names. Within 2 hours, the comments section exploded, with 17 different parents sharing stories about Mrs. Callahan going back 5 years. Screenshots started flooding in of emails she'd sent, complaints she'd filed, and one parent even had a recording of her saying she would make sure that kid never gets into a good school about their daughter who's now at community college. At lunch the next day, the basketball team guys came over to my table, which never happened before since I wasn't exactly part of their crowd. They said they'd testify about their squeaky shoes never being a problem in any other class, and one of them pulled out his phone to show me a video he'd recorded. It was Mrs. Callahan in the teacher's lounge right after the hearing, saying she had it out for me and was going to teach me a lesson about respect. They were all still pissed about Bailey being banned and wanted to help however they could. Alan Hopkins interviewed me for 2 hours in the conference room, taking notes on his laptop about everything from the Valentine's candy incident to the therapy dog situation. He kept asking me to repeat certain parts and seemed really interested in the timeline of when things happened, especially the therapy dog ban and my college rejections. He asked for my decibel meter data from the hearing and made copies of all my recordings, then mentioned this wasn't his first investigation involving Mrs. Callahan, but he couldn't say more about that. Word spread around school that there was an official investigation happening, and suddenly Mrs. Callahan came back acting like the nicest teacher ever. She brought donuts for the teacher's lounge, smiled at everyone in the hallways, and even tried to make small talk with students, but everyone could tell it was fake. Why does Mrs. Callahan care so much about squeaky shoes when the whole school is basically a noise factory? I'm curious what made her pick this particular kid to go after when basketball players squeak around all day. Other teachers were keeping their distance from her, and the substitute who covered her classes mentioned to us that she'd left 0 lesson plans for 3 days, which was against school policy. Veronica called us a week later saying she'd gotten responses from 3 of the colleges, confirming they'd received negative information about me after my applications were already submitted and under review. One admissions officer named Tamara Barrett from State was willing to provide a written statement about how unusual it was to get post-application calls about a student and how the information provided didn't match the student profile they'd reviewed. This was exactly what we needed to prove Mrs. Callahan had deliberately sabotaged my college applications after I'd already applied. The next morning, the principal's secretary called and said he wanted to see me right away. I grabbed my backpack and headed down the empty hallway to his office. He was sitting behind his desk looking tired and kept rubbing his temples like he had a headache. He closed the door and sat back down with this heavy sigh. He started talking about how Mrs. Callahan had been teaching for 15 years and how she was going through a really rough divorce. His voice got quieter when he said, maybe we could work something out without all the lawyers and paperwork. He kept saying things like, she didn't mean any harm and everyone makes mistakes when they're stressed. I told him I couldn't drop the complaint after what she did to my college applications. His shoulders dropped and he just nodded like he already knew what I was going to say. When I got home, my mom was on her laptop at the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere. She looked up with this huge smile and showed me her screen. She'd found out Mrs. Callahan had been using her school email account to contact the colleges about me. Every email she sent left a digital trail in the school's system that they couldn't delete. Veronica called within minutes and told us to demand the district preserve all electronic communications immediately. My mom typed up the request, while Veronica was still on speaker explaining what words to use. The IT department got involved that same afternoon and started pulling records from the servers. By the end of the day, Mrs. Callahan was placed on administrative leave while they investigated everything. The next morning at the school, everyone was talking about Bailey being gone and how unfair it was. This girl from my English class started a petition during lunch to bring him back. She set up a table near the cafeteria with a big poster of Bailey's picture and markers for people to sign. Within an hour, she had over 200 signatures, and kids were lining up between classes. By the second day, the petition had 800 names, including some teachers who signed when nobody was looking. The local news station showed up after school and interviewed students about the therapy dog ban. They didn't mention the investigation, but everyone knew something bigger was happening. Parents started posting on the school's Facebook page demanding answers about why Bailey was banned. The school board's email inbox was getting flooded with complaints from angry parents. Alan called Veronica 3 days later with something huge he'd discovered. He'd been going through my academic records and found Mrs. Callahan had changed my grades twice after the hearing. She dropped my A- in her class to a B+ and changed my participation grade from excellent to satisfactory. The changes were just enough to drop my GPA below the cutoff for automatic scholarship eligibility at State. He kept digging and found 3 other students over the past 5 years who'd complained about her. Every single one had grade changes right after they filed complaints with similar drops that affected their academic standing. The pattern was so clear that even the district couldn't ignore it anymore. Alan said he was adding all of this to his report for the state investigation. 2 days later, Valerie Holland called Veronica trying to work out a deal. She was the union representative and had to defend Mrs. Callahan, even though she didn't sound happy about it. Veronica put her on speaker so my mom and I could hear everything. Valerie admitted that Mrs. Callahan had been a problem for years, but the union had to protect her rights. She offered to have Mrs. Callahan write apology letters to me and the colleges if we dropped the investigation. She even said Mrs. Callahan would transfer to a different school next year. Veronica told her we needed time to think about it, but I already knew the answer. We refused the settlement offer the next morning, and Veronica filed additional complaints with the state education department. She also contacted the teacher licensing board about Mrs. Callahan's behavior and the grade changes Alan had found. The stakes got way higher than anyone expected when the licensing board opened their own investigation. Mrs. Callahan's teaching license was now under review, which meant she might never teach again anywhere in the state. The school board scheduled an emergency meeting after getting hundreds of emails from parents. They put me on the agenda to speak publicly about everything that had happened. The meeting was in the high school auditorium because they expected a big crowd. When we arrived, the parking lot was already full and people were walking in from the street. The auditorium was packed with angry parents and students holding signs about bringing Bailey back. Mrs. Callahan sat in the back row with a man in a suit who must have been her lawyer. She was taking notes on a yellow legal pad and wouldn't look at anyone. When they called my name, I walked up to the microphone with my phone in my hand. I started by explaining about the shoes and the harassment claim she filed against me. Then I played the recording I had of the counselor admitting she was pressured to send negative information to colleges messages. The whole room went silent, except for the counselor's voice coming through the speakers. The board members started looking at each other with worried faces, and the district's lawyer leaned over to whisper frantically to the superintendent. When the recording ended, several parents stood up shouting that Mrs. Callahan should be fired immediately. The board president had to bang his gavel to get everyone to quiet down. Mrs. Callahan suddenly stood up and demanded to speak, even though she wasn't on the agenda. She walked to the microphone with tears already running down her face. She started talking about her stress and sound sensitivity issues that made teaching difficult. She claimed I deliberately tortured her with my squeaky shoes, knowing it would trigger her condition. She said she was just trying to protect the learning environment for all students. Nobody in the audience looked convinced, and one board member actually rolled his eyes while she was talking. When she finished, the board went into a quick recess to discuss everything. They came back 15 minutes later, and the president announced their decisions. The board voted unanimously to reverse Bailey's ban effective immediately, and he would be back at the school tomorrow. They also ordered a full review of Mrs. Callahan's conduct, including all the grade changes Alan had found. The counselor was directed to send corrected information to all 5 colleges, explaining the error and confirming my actual academic record. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, while Mrs. Callahan grabbed her bag and stormed out with her lawyer following behind. The next morning, my phone started buzzing like crazy with emails from colleges. 2 of them had already moved me from rejected to waitlist status after getting the corrected info from our counselor. My hands were shaking as I opened the 3rd email from State University. The admissions lady, Tamara Barrett, had actually called my house phone and left a message saying they were looking at my application again with fresh eyes. Mom was already on the phone with Veronica telling her about all the emails coming in. I could hear Veronica's voice through the speaker saying something about momentum and keeping pressure on the district. That same afternoon, Alan showed up at our house with a thick folder of papers. He spread them out on our dining room table and started pointing at different documents. There were emails between Mrs. Callahan and the colleges with timestamps showing she'd contacted them right after our first hearing. She'd attached fake disciplinary reports that never existed in my actual school record. Alan had also found grade changes in the system, where she'd lowered my scores in other teachers' classes without their knowledge. One teacher had even filed a complaint when she noticed her gradebook had been changed. The investigation report recommended termination and said the district needed to decide whether to fight the recommendation or settle with us. Mom's eyes got wider with each page Alan showed us. 3 days later, we got a call from someone we never expected. Mrs. Callahan's ex-husband had tracked down my mom's number and wanted to meet at a coffee shop downtown. He brought a folder of his own with court documents from their divorce. He showed us texts and emails where Mrs. Callahan had been acting weird for months before our problems even started. She'd been calling him at all hours, claiming neighbors were making noise to harass her. He tried to get her help, but she refused to see anyone. He looked really tired and said he'd been worried about her being around kids, but didn't know who to tell. Mom thanked him for coming forward, but we both knew we had to stay focused on getting justice. The district's lawyers called Veronica the next week with a settlement offer. They wanted to pay back all my college application fees and write official letters to every school I'd applied to. Talk about digital karma. Mrs. Callahan used school email to trash a student and basically signed her own pink slip with every click of the send button. Pretty sure leave a paper trail of your revenge plot wasn't. They also offered to pay for a college consultant to help me with late applications. The settlement included a public apology from the district and new rules about teachers contacting colleges about students. Mrs. Callahan would be moved to a job with no student contact. Veronica called it a solid offer, but said we should push for more. We met with the district people in a conference room at their main office building. Mom insisted Mrs. Callahan couldn't have any access to student records or recommendations ever again. The district superintendent nodded and agreed to add that to the settlement. They also threw in payment for SAT prep courses and guaranteed positive recommendation letters from the principal and counselor. Veronica leaned over and whispered that this was a complete victory. We signed the papers right there. The best day came when Bailey returned to the school. Students had made signs and banners saying, "Welcome back, Bailey," and hung them all over the main entrance. When the therapy dog walked through the front doors with his handler, the whole hallway erupted in cheers. Kids were crying and hugging him while teachers stood in their doorways smiling. I noticed something funny though. At least 5 teachers were wearing brand new sneakers that squeaked loudly on the floor. They walked past the principal's office making as much noise as possible. The principal just stood there with his coffee pretending not to notice all the squeaking. Even the janitor had gotten new boots that made noise. 2 weeks later, I got the email I'd been waiting for. State University had accepted me for fall admission with a partial scholarship. Tamara Barrett had added a personal note at the bottom. She said she was impressed by how I'd handled everything and looked forward to having me on campus. Within the next few days, 3 more colleges reversed their rejections. One even offered me a spot in their honors program. Mom cried when she read that one. We went out for tacos to celebrate, and she kept showing the acceptance letters to random people at the restaurant. About a month later, one of my friends spotted Mrs. Callahan at the district office building. She was working in a back room doing data entry with no windows. My friend's mom worked there and said Mrs. Callahan ate lunch alone every day at her desk. She'd apparently tried to file for disability, claiming she had a sensitivity to sounds. The disability office rejected her claim. Some teachers from other schools started sharing their own stories about her online. One said she'd tried to get a kid expelled for clicking his pen too much. Another said she'd written up a girl for wearing jewelry that jingled. Then everything really blew up when the local news got hold of Alan's investigation report. They'd used some Freedom of Information law to get all the documents. The story ran on the evening news with Mrs. Callahan's picture right there on the screen. The reporter talked about abuse of power and showed screenshots of her fake disciplinary reports. Parents started commenting on the news station's social media with their own horror stories. One mom said Mrs. Callahan had tried to get her daughter kicked off the honor roll for humming. Another parent said she threatened their son for tapping his foot during a test. Her name was trending on local social media for 3 days straight. People were sharing memes about squeaky shoes and making jokes about her sound sensitivity. The district sent out an email to all parents saying they were reviewing their policies. A few weeks later, I got invited to speak at a district workshop about student rights. They wanted me to talk about standing up to authority abuse and the importance of keeping records. Mom sat in the front row, recording everything on her phone. I showed them screenshots of all my documentation and explained how recording those classroom sounds had saved me. After I finished, at least 10 students came up to me with their own stories about unfair treatment. One girl said her teacher had been changing her grades too. Another kid said his coach had been sending bad reports to recruiters. They all wanted to know how to document document everything like I did. The workshop organizer asked if I'd be willing to help train student advocates for each school. I told them I'd think about it, but honestly I was ready to focus on my own stuff. 2 days later, the school counselor pulled me aside after lunch and asked to talk privately. We went to her office and she closed the door behind us. She sat down and started apologizing for not standing up to Mrs. Callahan sooner. She said she knew things had gotten out of hand, but she was scared of confrontation. Then she offered to write me an extra recommendation letter for scholarships. She wanted to explain how I showed integrity under pressure and handled everything with maturity. I accepted her offer but kept my distance because where was the support 3 months ago? A week later, I got an email that made me jump out of my chair. My essay about the whole squeaky shoe situation had won a national contest about overcoming adversity. The prize was $5,000 for college expenses, plus they were publishing it in an education magazine. Now Mrs. Callahan's behavior would be documented forever in academic literature. My mom cried when she saw the check and hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. 3 weeks passed and senior awards night arrived at the school auditorium. I sat with my parents not expecting anything since my grades were good but not amazing. Then the principal called my name for the Citizenship Award for standing up for student rights and improving school culture. I walked up to the stage and noticed Mrs. Callahan's empty chair at the teacher's table. The principal gave his speech, but carefully avoided mentioning the whole incident directly. He just talked about courage and integrity in general terms while handing me the plaque. My mom took about 50 pictures from her seat. Prom came around 2 weeks later, and I knew exactly what I was wearing. I put on my rented tux with my squeaky Nikes as a statement. When I walked into the gym, at least 20 other students had done the same thing with their own squeaky shoes. The whole dance floor sounded like a rubber duck convention. Someone had even made a squeaky shoe remix about the incident, and the DJ played it twice. Everyone was laughing and squeaking around the dance floor. That's when my crush from Valentine's Day walked up to me near the punch bowl. She apologized for ghosting me after the candy incident and admitted she was scared of getting on Mrs. Callahan's bad side. She said she regretted not supporting me when everything went down. We shared one slow dance, but that chapter was closed for me. Final grades came out the next week, and I'd kept my GPA at 3.7 despite everything. Several teachers pulled me aside privately to say they gave me extra consideration, knowing what I went through. The substitute who took over Mrs. Callahan's class gave everyone A's, which definitely helped. My transcript looked solid for State University, where I'd already been accepted. The yearbook came out 3 days before graduation, and the committee had included a full page about Bailey's return. There were photos from the celebration day when he came back to the school. They also had a subtle reference to students who stand up for what's right with my picture next to it. Mrs. Callahan's faculty photo was missing from the teacher pages. Someone said they just forgot to include it, but we all knew better. Graduation rehearsal was scheduled for Thursday morning, and they selected me to give a short speech as the Citizenship Award winner. The principal reviewed my draft 3 times, making sure I wouldn't mention the incident directly. He kept suggesting edits and asking if I was sure about certain phrases. I agreed to keep it positive and forward-looking, just to get him off my back. Friday afternoon, my mom got a call from the district's lawyer, which made my stomach drop. Mrs. Callahan had filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against the district. She was claiming disability discrimination for her sound sensitivity condition. The lawyer said we might need to testify if it went to trial. The saga might not be over yet after all. Graduation day finally arrived on Saturday morning, and local news showed up to interview students. They pulled me aside asking about my college plans and the whole incident from this year. I stayed diplomatic and focused on positive changes, rather than dwelling on Mrs. Callahan. I talked about student advocacy and standing up for what's right without naming names. My mom, however, gave them an earful in Spanish that they had to subtitle later. She went off about teachers abusing power and schools protecting bad educators. The reporter's eyes got wider with every word she said. 2 weeks after the news segment aired, graduation day finally arrived, and I made sure to wear my squeaky Nikes one last time. The ceremony was in the gym, and every senior had to walk across that shiny wooden floor to get their diploma. When they called my name, I stood up and started my walk to the stage. My shoes squeaked with every single step I took. At first, there was this awkward silence. Then someone in the crowd started clapping really loud. More people joined in, and suddenly the whole graduating class was stomping their feet and making noise. The gym turned into this crazy loud celebration, and the principal just stood there shaking his head with this tired smile on his face. He handed me my diploma and leaned in close enough that I could smell his coffee breath. "Please tell me you're not wearing those to college," he said, but I could see he was trying not to laugh. The graduation party afterwards was at this fancy hotel my parents couldn't really afford, but my mom insisted on booking anyway. I was standing by the punch bowl when a group of underclassmen came up to me. Mrs. Callahan filing a wrongful termination lawsuit for sound sensitivity after she harassed a student for squeaky shoes. The same person who threatened kids for clicking pens and wearing jingly jewelry suddenly has a disability. This sophomore girl pulled out her phone and showed me this app she'd downloaded for recording classes. She said after everything that happened with me and Mrs. Callahan, she wasn't taking any chances with bad teachers anymore. Another kid said his older brother had started recording every interaction with his chemistry teacher, who liked to change test dates without warning. 3 more students told me similar stories about standing up to unfair teachers and using evidence to protect themselves. The whole culture at the school had shifted, and teachers were being way more careful about how they treated students. 3 weeks passed, and I was working my summer job at the mall when my phone buzzed with an official-looking email. The State Board of Education had made their final decision about Mrs. Callahan's teaching license, and she'd been suspended for 2 whole years. The document said she had to complete 200 hours of training on appropriate classroom management and professional conduct before she could even apply to teach again. She also had to go through counseling sessions about workplace behavior and power dynamics in educational settings. My hands were shaking as I read through all the violations they'd found during their investigation. Turns out I wasn't the only student who'd filed complaints over the years, but mine was the one that finally broke through. That same week, I decided to start a YouTube channel about student rights, since so many people had been asking me for advice. My first video was just me sitting in my room talking about how to document evidence in classrooms, and it got shared by this big education advocate group on Twitter. Within 3 days, it had 50,000 views, and lawyers were reaching out in the comments offering to help create more content. By the end of summer, I had 10,000 subscribers and was getting invited to speak at the school board meetings across the state. The channel became this whole thing I never expected, but it felt good helping other students who were dealing with bad teachers. August rolled around and State University orientation weekend weekend arrived faster than I expected. I was standing in line to get my dorm key when this woman in a suit walked up to me. It was Tamara Barrett from the news segment, and she recognized me immediately, even though I wasn't wearing my squeaky shoes. She grabbed my arm and dragged me over to meet the dean, who was talking to a group of parents nearby. "This is the squeaky shoe kid who fought back," she said, and the dean's face lit up with recognition. He shook my hand and told me they'd actually changed their whole application review process because of what happened to me. They now required multiple reviewers for any application with negative teacher comments and had implemented an appeals process for students who suspected retaliation. He said my case had become required reading in their admissions training program. Back home, my mom had turned our living room into what she called her trophy wall while I was at orientation. She'd taken the original harassment complaint Mrs. Callahan filed against me and had it professionally framed in this expensive gold frame. She hung it right next to my college acceptance letter and the newspaper article about the whole incident. Every single person who came to visit got the full tour and story, whether they wanted it or not. The mailman knew the story, the pizza delivery guy knew the story, even the Jehovah's Witnesses who came to our door got trapped. Listening to my mom explain every detail, she'd point at each document and explain what it meant like she was giving a museum tour. The school district announced new mandatory training requirements for all teachers the week before I left for college. Everyone had to attend sessions on recognizing retaliation, understanding student rights, and appropriate responses to classroom disruptions. Teachers were calling it the Callahan Protocol in the hallways, even though the official name was something boring about professional standards. My friend who still had a year left told me teachers were definitely thinking twice before targeting students now. One afternoon in late August, I was at the grocery store buying stuff for my dorm when I turned the corner and almost crashed my cart into Mrs. Callahan. We made the most awkward eye contact, and I could see her face turn red under the fluorescent lights. She looked terrible with dark circles under her eyes and her hair all messy. She abandoned her half-full cart right there in the cereal aisle and speed walked toward the exit on the other side of the store. My mom heard from her hairdresser that Mrs. Callahan had put her house up for sale and was planning to move to Arizona or somewhere far away. The next day, I got a Facebook message from a family I'd never met whose son had Mrs. Callahan 5 years ago. They said their kid had dropped out of school because of her constant harassment about his stutter and how she'd humiliated him in front of the whole class repeatedly. Seeing her finally face consequences gave them closure they'd been waiting years for. They were considering filing their own lawsuit now that everything had come out about her pattern of behavior. As I packed up my room for college, I carefully wrapped my squeaky Nikes in tissue paper and placed them in a special box my mom had bought. They were too worn out to wear anymore, but I couldn't throw them away either. Those shoes had started something way bigger than just annoying one mean teacher. They'd exposed a whole system that protected bad educators and punished students who spoke up. I labeled the box "The Shoes That Changed Everything" and put it on the top shelf of my closet where they'd be safe until I came back for winter break. 2 weeks later, the mailman knocked on our door with a certified letter that needed my signature. The district's official seal was stamped on the thick envelope, and my hands shook a little as I tore it open. Inside were 3 pages of legal stuff, but the important part was highlighted in yellow by someone at the district office. All records of Mrs. Callahan's original harassment complaint against me had been permanently deleted from my file and replaced with documentation showing she had retaliated against a student. My permanent record was completely clean for any college or job that might check it in the future. Mom photocopied it 5 times and put copies in her filing cabinet, the safe deposit box, and even laminated one to keep in her purse. The week before I left for State University, I got a call from the principal asking if I'd come speak at the new teacher orientation about appropriate boundaries with students. When I walked into the auditorium wearing my brand new white sneakers that didn't make any sound at all, I saw about 40 new teachers sitting there with notebooks ready. I stood at the podium and told them the whole story from the beginning, watching their faces go from confused to shocked to angry as I explained how one teacher's obsession with my squeaky shoes had almost ruined my future. The principal had me show them the video compilation I'd made of all the classroom sounds louder than my shoes, and when they saw Mrs. Callahan slamming her stapler while complaining about noise, several teachers actually gasped. After I finished, they gave me a standing ovation, and the principal announced they were implementing the Callahan Protocol, a new policy requiring any teacher complaints about students to go through multiple reviews before any action could be taken. On my last day in town, I stopped by the high school to visit Bailey one more time. The therapy dog was in the counseling office surrounded by 3 students who were petting him and looking way more relaxed than they had when I'd walked by earlier. His handler showed me Bailey's Instagram account on her phone, where he had over 10,000 followers and daily posts of him helping different students. She grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard, thanking me for fighting to bring him back after Mrs. Callahan got him banned. Bailey seemed to remember me too, his tail going crazy as he pushed his head against my leg for scratches. The next morning, Mom and I loaded up her car with all my college stuff and started the 4-hour drive to State University. About an hour into the drive, we passed a huge billboard on the highway that made Mom slam on the brakes and pull over to the shoulder. Edit. The billboard showed a picture of a stern-looking teacher with a big red X over her face and text that said, "Retaliation against students is never acceptable," with the school district's logo at the bottom. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand tight. "You did that, mijo." Sometimes standing up to power with something as simple as squeaky shoes can change everything for everyone who comes after you. Time to squeak off into the sunset, folks. Appreciate you letting me be your clever companion through this wild ride. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.